25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers. Enough firepower to glass every rebel world in an afternoon. And they still lost. Not because the rebels outgunned them, but because Palpatine built a fleet for broadside warfare in a guerrilla galaxy. That number deserves to sink in. 25,000. Each one a 1,600-meter wedge of angular menace, carrying 60 turbolaser batteries, 60 ion cannons, and 72 TIE fighters in its belly. The mathematics of intimidation were supposed to be simple. No insurgent force could possibly assemble enough ships to challenge that kind of firepower. Any conventional opponent would be atomized before they finished powering up their shields. And here's the thing. The math was right. Against any conventional opponent, the Imperial Navy would have been invincible. The Star Destroyer wasn't a bad design. It was a magnificent achievement of military engineering, purpose-built to win the kind of war Palpatine understood. The rebellion refused to fight that war. This is the autopsy of a corpse that should have been immortal. Not because the Empire was incompetent, they weren't, but because they were brilliantly competent at solving the wrong problem. They built a hammer so perfect, so overwhelming, so terrifyingly efficient, that they forgot one small detail. Sometimes your enemy is a screw. The Star Destroyer's fatal flaw wasn't hidden in some obscure technical readout. It was built into the design philosophy from day one, visible to anyone willing to look. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer, the refined successor that would form the backbone of the Imperial Navy, featured heavily reinforced hull plating and shields powerful enough to shrug off sustained capital ship fire. Its turbolaser batteries could reduce an enemy frigate to slag from thousands of kilometers away. What the Imperial II did not feature, what it deliberately, consciously chose not to include, were point defense weapons. No rapid tracking cannons optimized for engaging small, fast-moving targets. No automated targeting systems designed to intercept incoming torpedoes. No layered defensive screens intended to protect against starfighter attack runs. The TIE fighters were the point defense system, not a backup, not one layer of a layered defense, the only layer. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a cost-cutting measure because the budget got tight. This was doctrine. Imperial High Command looked at the design specifications and said, "We don't need point defense batteries. The TIE screen is sufficient." That decision killed an empire. The philosophy behind it was elegant in its simplicity. TIE fighters were cheap, numerous, and expendable. A single Star Destroyer carried 72 of them, ready to launch at a moment's notice. When enemy fighters approached, the TIEs would swarm out, engage them in close-range dogfights, and destroy them before they ever threatened the mothership. The capital ship's heavy weapons would focus on enemy capital ships, the real threat, the only threat that mattered. Starfighters were annoyances to be swatted by other starfighters, while the serious business of fleet warfare continued above them. For over a decade, against the enemies the Empire expected to face, this philosophy worked perfectly. But here's what the doctrine couldn't account for. Proton torpedoes travel at roughly 20,000 kilometers per hour. That's 5.5 kilometers per second relative to their launch platform. When an X-Wing pilot locks on and fires from standard attack range, that torpedo closes the distance in heartbeats. Not seconds, heartbeats. A TIE pilot attempting to intercept that torpedo faces a reaction window measured in fractions of a second. Spot the launch, calculate the vector, maneuver into firing position, acquire lock, fire with precision sufficient to hit a target moving at hypersonic speeds. Human reflexes can't do it. They just can't. The standard TIE/LN lacked shields, advanced sensors, or meaningful communications equipment. It was optimized for close-range dogfighting against enemy fighters, knife fights in space where pilot skill determined everything. Nobody designed it to intercept guided munitions screaming toward the mothership faster than thought allows. The mathematics were brutal, and nobody in Imperial High Command bothered to run them until it was far too late. The torpedoes would get through. Some of them, at least, would always get through. And that was all the rebellion needed. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what war looked like when Palpatine was designing his navy. The Clone Wars had defined military thinking for an entire generation of officers. Every flag officer in the Imperial Navy had earned their rank in that conflict, learning lessons that would shape doctrine for decades to come. Lessons that were absolutely correct for the war they'd fought, and catastrophically wrong for the war they were about to face. The Separatist Confederacy fielded enormous battleships, most notably the Lucrehulk-class vessels, converted Trade Federation cargo haulers repurposed into warships of frightening scale. Picture the tactical problem these ships represented. A single Lucrehulk, its distinctive donut shape bristling with 42 quad turbolaser batteries. In its cavernous holds, 1,500 Vulture-class droid starfighters waited for deployment, controlled by central processing units that could coordinate swarm attacks with mathematical precision. The Confederacy's strategy was simple: overwhelm Republican defenses with sheer numbers. Massive capital ships, swarms of expendable fighters, form battle lines, exchange broadsides. Bigger fleet wins. This was conventional warfare at its most brutal. Two industrial powers throwing everything they had at each other, each trying to grind the other down through attrition. The Republic responded with increasingly powerful warships of its own, culminating in the Vendor-class Star Destroyers that would provide the genetic blueprint for the later Imperial vessels. When these fleets clashed, the battles looked like something from the Age of Sail. Battle lines forming, broadsides exchanging, smaller craft wheeling around the Titans in organized formations. Now imagine 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers dropping out of hyperspace to face that enemy. Picture the tactical display on a Separatist command ship. The sensor officer's voice goes flat as contact after contact appears on screen. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of Imperial signatures resolving out of hyperspace, each one registering the distinctive wedge profile of a Star Destroyer. The fleet stretches across the tactical display like a gray tide, each vessel positioning itself with the mechanical precision of ships that have drilled this formation 1,000 times. The Separatist commander would feel the cold certainty of mathematics closing in. His fleet isn't small, hundreds of Lucrehulks forming into their standard battle configuration, the central control ships coordinating deployment of wave after wave of droid fighters. Providence-class dreadnoughts anchoring the flanks, those sleek, predatory vessels that gave even the Venator-class trouble during the war, their heavy turbolaser batteries already warming for the engagement. Munificent-class frigates screening the larger vessels, their banking clan sponsors having invested heavily in the ship's construction. It's the Clone Wars all over again, the kind of fleet engagement that defined an era. Numbers matter in conventional warfare. Mass matters. The droid control network is online, fighter deployment proceeding on schedule, all batteries charged and ready. This is the battle they trained for. And then the Star Destroyers open fire. 60 turbolaser batteries per ship. Concentrated firepower that makes the Clone Wars-era Venators look like patrol boats in comparison. The Imperial formation doesn't need to break. It doesn't need to maneuver cleverly. It doesn't need to exploit tactical opportunities or seek advantageous positioning. It doesn't need anything except to advance and shoot. Each Star Destroyer can engage multiple enemy vessels simultaneously, the advanced targeting computers distributing fire across the enemy formation with mechanical efficiency. The math becomes merciless. For every Lucrehulk in the Separatist fleet, the Empire brings the firepower of dozens of Star Destroyers converging on target. Those quad turbolaser batteries that seemed so formidable during the Clone Wars, they're exchanging fire with vessels carrying 4 times the armament. The Lucrehulk's shields weren't designed to absorb this kind of punishment. Nothing was designed to absorb this kind of punishment. Nothing in the known galaxy could withstand the concentrated fire of a dozen Star Destroyers pouring green death into a single target. The droid fighters swarm forward, and 72 TIE fighters per Star Destroyer swarm right back. That's over 1.8 million TIE fighters if you launch the full complement of 25,000 ships. Against droid pilots running combat algorithms from central control ships, algorithms that were programmed during the Clone Wars and haven't been updated since. Here's the thing about droid fighters. They were cheap and expendable, mass-produced in factories that churned them out by the millions. But they depended on central coordination. Their combat algorithms were good enough for swarming tactics against outnumbered Republican forces, against a wall of TIE fighters outnumbering them by orders of magnitude, against human pilots who could adapt, improvise, break formation when the situation demanded it. The droid fighters follow their programming into kill boxes that human pilots would recognize and avoid. They execute attack patterns that worked against Venators and fail catastrophically against the improved targeting systems of Imperial-era vessels. The Separatist fleet doesn't lose this engagement. It ceases to exist. Debris fields where battle lines used to be. The Empire's broadside doctrine working exactly as designed. Palpatine's military philosophy vindicated in sheets of green turbolaser fire. The Providence dreadnoughts, the most dangerous vessels in the Separatist arsenal, burn like torches against the void. The munificent frigates, never designed to stand against this kind of firepower, simply vanish in expanding spheres of flame. The Lucrehulks, those mighty converted cargo haulers, crack open under sustained turbolaser bombardment, their droid fighter bays exposed to vacuum before the fighters can even launch. Total victory. Utter annihilation. The 25,000 doing exactly what they were designed to do. The same math works against the Yuuzhan Vong. Different enemy, different era, same principle. When the extragalactic invaders finally arrived decades after Endor, they came with world ships and coral skippers and biotechnology that made conventional weapons partially ineffective. Their organic vessels could regenerate damage. Their Dovan basals created miniature singularities that could absorb incoming fire. Their warriors considered death in battle the highest honor, and fought with a fanaticism that unnerved even hardened military professionals. They nearly conquered the galaxy. But here's what most analyses miss. The Yuuzhan Vong fought conventional fleet engagements. They massed their forces. They formed battle lines. They committed to decisive engagements where superior numbers and firepower would carry the day. Their strategy was, in essence, identical to the Separatist Confederacy's strategy. Overwhelm the enemy with concentrated force, grind them down through attrition, conquer through superior mass. They wanted to stand and fight. They gloried in it. Against a fragmented New Republic that had demilitarized after Endor, that had dismantled the Imperial fleet capacity, because surely the galaxy would never need such overwhelming force again, this strategy worked. The New Republic Navy was a shadow of what the Empire had commanded. They had neither the ships nor the industrial capacity to match the Vong world ship by world ship. But imagine those same Yuuzhan Vong world ships facing 25,000 Star Destroyers at the height of Imperial power. The Empire at its peak produced Star Destroyers faster than the Vong could grow new world ships. Kuat drive yards alone employed millions of workers across multiple planetary systems. Entire industrial complexes dedicated to the construction of vessels that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. The biotechnology advantage would have mattered in individual engagements. Coral skippers were nimble, and the Yorick coral armor resisted conventional weapons. But when you're outnumbered 100 to 1, when every world ship faces a dozen Star Destroyers pouring concentrated fire into its organic hull, biological regeneration has limits. Those limits get reached very quickly when 60 turbolaser batteries are testing them simultaneously. The Dovan basals could create singularities to absorb incoming fire, but they couldn't absorb everything. Not when the fire came from every direction, in overwhelming volumes, without pause or mercy. The Vong fought bravely. They would have died bravely, and they would have died. The Star Destroyer wasn't designed wrong. It was designed right, for enemies who fought the way Palpatine expected enemies to fight. Proud, conventional, standing their ground. Now cut to Yavin. 30 snub fighters. That's it. 30 craft, X-Wings and Y-Wing bombers, against a battle station defended by thousands of weapons emplacements, multiple TIE fighter squadrons, and 15,000 heavy turbolaser batteries, supplemented by another 15,000 standard batteries. The Death Star was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of Imperial military philosophy. So much firepower concentrated in one place that resistance became mathematically impossible. On paper, this should have been a demonstration of Imperial superiority so one-sided it barely qualified as a battle. The Alliance was throwing snub fighters against a moon-sized battle station. It was suicide dressed up as strategy, the tactical equivalent of attacking a fortress with slingshots. But those heavy turbolaser batteries? Designed to engage capital ships at thousands of kilometers. The tracking systems were optimized for slow, predictable targets, enemy frigates maneuvering into firing position, cruisers trying to bring their own weapons to bear. When an X-Wing pilot pulled 9G turns in a 2-mile deep trench, the turbolaser batteries couldn't compensate. Their targeting computers kept trying to lead targets that weren't moving in straight lines, kept calculating firing solutions for enemies that zigged when the algorithm predicted they would zag. The massive weapons that could reduce a Mon Calamari cruiser to slag in seconds were utterly useless against craft small enough to fly between the gun emplacements. The Flaw was even worse than it appeared. One engineering report, buried in technical documentation that apparently nobody in the command structure bothered to read, described the thermal exhaust port vulnerability with remarkable prescience. The assessment was blunt. Lazy, terrible design, born of arrogance rather than rigorous threat assessment. Someone had identified the problem. Someone had written it down. Someone had filed it in the proper channels. Nobody with authority listened. The exhaust port was 2 meters wide. It led directly to the main reactor, and its only protection was a simple ray shield, standard equipment for keeping environmental hazards out of critical systems, completely ineffective against proton torpedoes that were specifically designed to penetrate ray shielding. The Alliance Intelligence Network had obtained the technical readouts. They had analyzed the vulnerability. They had designed an attack profile specifically to exploit it. Approach through the trench to minimize turbolaser exposure, stay below the horizon line of the defensive batteries, make the final run at full throttle before TIE pursuit could catch up. Every element of the attack was engineered to exploit exactly the gaps that Imperial doctrine couldn't acknowledge. The TIE fighters launched in pursuit numbered 4. 4. Darth Vader and 3 wingmen, because the command structure couldn't conceive that starfighters posed an existential threat. 30 rebel pilots against the most powerful battle station ever constructed, and the Empire committed 4 interceptors to stop them. Why only 4? This is where doctrine becomes destiny. The Death Star's commanders didn't believe starfighters could threaten the station. Not really. They believed it the way a mountain might believe in ants. Sure, technically the ants existed. Technically they were attacking. But what could they possibly do? The station's superlaser could destroy planets. Its armor plating was meters thick. Its shield generators could absorb fire that would glass a moon. The turbolasers would handle any real threat. The fighter screen was a formality, deployed because procedures demanded it, not because anyone expected the attack to succeed. 4 ties were enough for a formality. More would have been an admission that the threat was real, and admitting the threat was real would have contradicted everything the Tarkin doctrine taught about the impossibility of resistance. Grand Moff Tarkin himself dismissed the attack with contempt. The man who had codified the Empire's philosophy of rule through terror couldn't conceive that terror might fail. He'd spent years building a weapon specifically designed to make resistance unthinkable, and when resistance came anyway, his mind couldn't process it. Luke Skywalker's proton torpedoes proved otherwise. Those torpedoes were designed to penetrate ray shields. The standard ray shielding protecting that exhaust port, the kind that protected critical systems across every Imperial installation, offered no resistance to proton torpedo warheads. The weapons the Rebellion had chosen specifically bypassed the protection the Empire relied upon. 2 torpedoes, 2 meters of shaft, 1 reactor. When the Death Star exploded in a sphere of expanding flame visible from the surface of Yavin 4, it should have triggered an immediate doctrinal reassessment across the entire Imperial military. A battle station the size of a small moon destroyed by a single pilot in a single fighter firing 2 proton torpedoes. Everything the Imperial Navy believed about the irrelevance of starfighter threats had just been proven catastrophically wrong. It didn't matter. Tarkin was dead. vaporized along with millions of Imperial personnel, so blame could be conveniently assigned to a corpse. The exhaust port vulnerability was classified. Technical reports were sealed. The official narrative became one of rebel treachery aided by unlikely fortune rather than systemic design failure. A Jedi had been involved. That explained everything, didn't it? Mystical powers, not doctrinal failure. An aberration, not a pattern. The TIE fighter wasn't redesigned to incorporate better sensors for interception work. The Star Destroyer's weapon systems weren't retrofitted with point defense capabilities. The Imperial II class, with its deliberately absent anti-fighter armament, continued rolling off the production lines at Kuat drive yards. If anything, production accelerated. More Star Destroyers, more broadside firepower, more of the same philosophy that had just been proven wrong. Palpatine, having watched his ultimate weapon destroyed by the exact vulnerability his doctrine couldn't acknowledge, doubled down on the philosophy that had produced the failure. Construction began on a second Death Star, and the rebellion, having found the gap in Imperial armor, began driving proton torpedoes through it over and over again. Here's the thing that makes this truly tragic. The Empire did try to fix the problem. They just did it wrong. The Lancer-class frigate was designed specifically to address the starfighter threat that Imperial doctrine kept insisting didn't exist. 20 quad laser cannons, optimized for anti-fighter work. Advanced targeting computers designed to track small, fast-moving targets. No heavy turbolasers, no ion cannons, no pretense of being anything other than what it was. A point defense platform designed to protect larger vessels from the exact threat that had killed the Death Star. The Lancer was everything the Imperial II class should have included. Those quad laser batteries could track X-wings through evasive maneuvers. They could intercept proton torpedoes at ranges that actually allowed reaction time. They could provide a second layer of defense that TIE fighters were supposed to make unnecessary. The Lancer should have been the solution. Build enough of them, attach them to Star Destroyer task forces, let them handle the snub fighter problem while the big ships focused on capital ship engagements. Layered defense, exactly what the doctrine needed. The Imperial Navy commissioned a few of them. A few. In a fleet of 25,000 Star Destroyers, the number of dedicated anti-fighter platforms remained laughably inadequate. Why? Because building Lancers was an implicit admission that the tie screen doctrine had failed. Because every Lancer that rolled off the production lines represented resources that could have gone toward another Star Destroyer. Because the officers who advocated for more Lancers were advocating for a solution to a problem that doctrine said didn't exist, and advocating for such solutions was career suicide in the Imperial command structure. Because bad news didn't flow upward in Palpatine's empire. The Lancers that were built got deployed, and they worked. When a Lancer-class frigate screened for a Star Destroyer, Rebel attack runs became significantly more costly. The quad laser batteries could track X-wings. They could intercept proton torpedoes at ranges that actually allowed reaction time. They did exactly what they were designed to do. But there were never enough of them. There could never be enough of them, because acknowledging the need for enough of them would have required acknowledging that the fundamental design philosophy of the entire Imperial Navy was flawed. And acknowledging that would have required admitting that decisions made by Grand Moffs, by fleet admirals, by the Emperor himself, had been wrong. So the production lines at Kuat kept building Imperial II-class Star Destroyers with no point defense. And Rebel pilots kept finding ways to get proton torpedoes through tie screens. And the Empire kept bleeding from wounds it refused to acknowledge. This is where the story stops being about military doctrine and starts being about something uglier, something more familiar, something that anyone who's ever worked in a dysfunctional organization will recognize immediately. The biggest confidence scheme Palpatine ever pulled on the galaxy wasn't the manipulation of the Clone Wars or the extermination of the Jedi. It was convincing the citizenry that Imperial rule would be more efficient, more competent, and more rational than the Republic it replaced. Think about the sales pitch. The Republic was paralyzed by bureaucracy. Thousands of senators debating endlessly while nothing got done. corrupt officials skimming from every program, regional interests blocking necessary reforms. The Clone Wars had proven that the Republic couldn't even defend itself without emergency powers that bypassed the normal legislative process. The Empire would be different, streamlined, efficient, one vision, one authority, one direction. No more endless debates, no more gridlock. When a problem emerged, it would be solved, decisively, immediately, without the procedural delays that had hamstrung the Republic for generations. Order would replace chaos. Strength would replace weakness. It was a compelling pitch. Billions believed it. Trillions hoped it was true. It was also a lie. In reality, the Empire inherited the exact same bloated bureaucracy, the same corrupt regional officials, the same institutional inertia that had paralyzed the Republic in its final years. The same bureaucrats shuffled the same papers. The same committees met to discuss the same issues they'd been discussing for decades. The same regional governors who had been skimming under the Republic continued skimming under the Empire, with the added benefit that there was no longer any meaningful oversight. What Palpatine added wasn't efficiency, but brutality. The willingness to solve problems through violence rather than negotiation, through terror rather than persuasion. When a world's governor reported unrest, the Republic would have dispatched mediators, formed committees, debated appropriate responses. The Empire dispatched Star Destroyers. The problem was solved, in the sense that dead people don't file complaints. But the underlying issues, resource distribution, representation, economic inequality, all the grievances that had fueled separatist sentiment in the first place, remained completely unaddressed. The Empire didn't solve problems. It suppressed symptoms. And suppression works right up until it doesn't. Regional governors could report that their sectors were pacified because dissent was punished with overwhelming force. Never mind whether the underlying grievances were addressed. Star Destroyer captains could report successful patrols because no enemy fleet had engaged them in open battle. Never mind whether the guerrilla cells proliferating across their patrol routes were actually being suppressed. Every metric the Empire used to measure success was designed to confirm that Imperial methods were working, even when they weren't. The Empire created a system where telling the truth was career suicide, where conforming to doctrine was the only path to advancement, where the appearance of control mattered more than the achievement of actual results. The Tarkin doctrine, fear will keep the local systems in line, was the military expression of a governing philosophy that prioritized perception over reality. Note the operative word, fear. Not tactical flexibility, not adaptive response, not the ability to counter unexpected threats. Fear. The Imperial military wasn't designed to fight wars. It was designed to prevent them through the sheer psychological weight of its existence. And when that psychology failed, when the rebellion proved that fear wasn't enough, the Empire had no plan B. It couldn't have a plan B, because the existence of a plan B would imply that plan A might fail, and plan A couldn't fail because the Emperor had designed it personally. Consider the position of a junior officer who noticed that TIE fighter screens were consistently failing to intercept rebel torpedo attacks. In a functional military organization, the correct response would be to report the pattern up the chain of command so doctrine could be adjusted. Run the analysis, identify the failure point, develop countermeasures. This is basic institutional learning, the kind of feedback loop that allows organizations to adapt and improve. In the Imperial Navy, such a report would constitute implicit criticism of decisions made by superior officers. Perhaps, if the criticism reached high enough, decisions made by Grand Moffs or the Emperor himself. Darth Vader's habit of executing subordinates who failed him wasn't an aberration. It was the visible manifestation of a system that punished bad news while rewarding the appearance of success. Admiral Ozzel dropped out of hyperspace too close to Hoth and was force-choked on the bridge. The lesson was clear. Failure meant death. And what was reporting a systemic vulnerability except admitting that you had identified a failure? Report a problem? You're the problem. Suggest that doctrine might be flawed? You're suggesting that your superiors were wrong, and your superiors have the authority to have you airlocked. Keep your head down, follow procedures, hope that whatever's going wrong happens in someone else's sector. The Empire functioned less like a military organization and more like a deeply dysfunctional workplace, where middle managers demanded compliance over results. Picture the energy of a store manager demanding to speak with the customer's supervisor because someone filed a complaint. More concerned with defending institutional honor than addressing the substance of the problem. Absolutely certain that any criticism represents a personal attack rather than useful feedback. Unable to distinguish between "this process isn't working" and "you personally are a failure." The customers, in this case, were rebel pilots systematically exploiting the gaps in Imperial defense, and they weren't asking for refunds. This management culture created a feedback loop that guaranteed the Empire could never learn from its failures. Every catastrophe became someone else's fault. Every systemic vulnerability became an isolated incident. Every junior officer who might have identified a problem learned to keep their mouth shut and their TIE pilots on standard patrol patterns. The doctrine said TIE fighters were adequate, so TIE fighters were adequate. Period. Questioning that doctrine was questioning the judgment of everyone who had approved it, implemented it, and built their careers on it. Careers ended when people questioned doctrine. Sometimes lives ended too. Grand Admiral Thrawn represented the exception that proved the rule. The Chiss strategist studied his enemies, adapted his tactics, and achieved victories that the rigid Imperial doctrine couldn't replicate. He recognized that different adversaries required different approaches. He analyzed rebel artwork to understand their psychology. He learned from defeats rather than executing everyone associated with them. He promoted competence over compliance. And where did that get him? Commanding a backwater fleet in the unknown regions, as far from the centers of power as the Emperor could exile him without actually removing him from service. Thrawn's competence made him dangerous to the established order, precisely because it demonstrated that the established order was incompetent. He was tolerated because his abilities were occasionally useful. He was never embraced, because embracing him would have meant admitting that everyone else was doing it wrong. The Empire didn't reward adaptation. It couldn't reward adaptation. Adaptation required acknowledging that current approaches weren't working, and acknowledging that current approaches weren't working was career suicide. So the Star Destroyers kept their stripped-down defensive armament, and the TIE fighters kept flying without shields or hyperdrives, and the torpedo attacks kept getting through. There's a real-world parallel that makes this dynamic viscerally clear, and it doesn't require any classified military analysis to understand. The Toyota Hilux pickup truck. In 1987, Chadian forces armed with Toyota pickup trucks fought a war against the Libyan military and won. The conflict became known as the Great Toyota War, not as a joke, but as a literal description of how the war was fought and won. The Libyans fielded tanks, armored personnel carriers, attack helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft supplied by Soviet advisors who knew exactly how conventional mechanized warfare was supposed to work. They had every technological advantage. They had armor. They had air support. They had military doctrine refined through decades of Cold War development. They had everything a modern military was supposed to have. The Chadians had pickup trucks, Toyota Hiluxes fitted with heavy machine guns and anti-tank guided missiles, crewed by fighters who had spent years learning the desert terrain. They called them technicals. The Chadians used the vehicle's speed and maneuverability to avoid direct engagement with Libyan armor, while picking off isolated units with anti-tank missiles. The missiles were the key. Like proton torpedoes, they were specifically designed to penetrate armor that conventional weapons couldn't scratch. A Libyan tank commander, watching a Toyota racing across the desert, didn't fear the truck itself. What could a pickup do against a tank? But the missile mounted in that truck bed could kill his vehicle before he could bring his main gun to bear. The weapon bypassed the protection the doctrine relied upon. This wasn't luck. This was asymmetric warfare executed at near perfection by an adversary who understood that conventional engagement was suicide An unconventional engagement was victory. The Chadians didn't try to match the Libyans tank for tank, helicopter for helicopter. They changed the nature of the war to something their resources could win. A $30,000 pickup truck with a mounted gun has, repeatedly, proven capable of defeating military hardware that costs millions. Not by destroying that hardware in direct engagement, by making it irrelevant. By refusing to fight on terms that favor the expensive, powerful, slow-to-adapt conventional force. The Chadian fighters didn't try to out-tank the Libyans. They changed the nature of the engagement to something their Toyotas could win. The X-Wing was the Toyota Hilux of the Star Wars galaxy, a starfighter that cost a fraction of what the Empire spent on TIE fighter production runs. The Alliance often acquired them secondhand, rebuilt from Republic-era surplus, carrying proton torpedoes that could cripple systems the Imperial doctrine insisted were untouchable. The Rebellion didn't need to destroy Star Destroyers in direct combat. They needed to make the Star Destroyers irrelevant by striking targets those massive vessels couldn't protect. Convoy ambushes across the Outer Rim followed a pattern that Imperial analysts should have recognized, but couldn't, because recognizing it would have required acknowledging doctrinal failure. Rebel X-Wings would hyper in at close range, launch torpedoes before TIE screens could respond, and escape to hyperspace before Imperial reinforcements could arrive. The torpedoes would strike vulnerable cargo vessels or lightly defended supply ships, depriving Imperial garrisons of materiel. Minimal losses, maximum impact, and absolutely nothing the Star Destroyers could do about it. The X-Wings didn't try to outgun the Star Destroyers. They changed the nature of the engagement to something their starfighters could win. At base assaults, Y-wing bombers would exploit the sluggish tracking of heavy turbolaser batteries to deliver payloads against shield generators and command structures. The weapons designed to reduce enemy frigates to slag couldn't track craft pulling evasive maneuvers at full throttle. The targeting computers kept trying to solve for capital ship engagements, while the actual threat screamed past at fighter speeds. The TIE fighters launched in response would engage the bombers in dogfights, doing exactly what they were designed to do, while other Alliance craft completed attack runs against critical targets. The TIEs could kill Y-wings. They killed plenty of them. But they couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't intercept everything at once, couldn't cover every approach vector while also engaging enemy fighters. The Imperial Navy, designed to win decisive fleet engagements, found itself bleeding from 1,000 small cuts. Every time an Imperial commander requested additional defensive capabilities, point defense batteries, improved sensor systems, fighter modifications, more Lancer-class frigates, the request was denied. Because it contradicted doctrine. Because admitting the need for point defense meant admitting the TIE screen philosophy had failed. Because bad news didn't flow upward in the Empire. Because the store manager didn't want to hear complaints. The Star Destroyer was almost totally vulnerable behind its engines. Analysis of captured Imperial technical documents, the kind of intelligence the Alliance risked lives to obtain, revealed that ships like the later Executor-class Super Star Destroyers were almost totally vulnerable behind their engines. The massive thrust nozzles that propelled 1,600 meters of hull through space couldn't be adequately protected by forward-facing shield generators without compromising propulsion performance. Alliance tacticians learned this. They shared it through intelligence networks. They built attack profiles around it. Fighter wings approaching from the stern could evade the primary turbolaser arcs while positioning for runs against critical propulsion systems. The TIE fighter screen, focused on engaging enemy fighters and protecting against frontal assault, often left the stern inadequately defended because using TIEs for persistent defensive patrol around every vulnerable point was considered a waste of resources. Why tie up fighters flying circles around the engine bank when those fighters could be destroying the enemy? The enemy would be destroyed before they could exploit such weaknesses. That was the doctrine. The doctrine was wrong. Endor was supposed to fix everything. Palpatine designed the engagement personally, the second Death Star as bait, luring the rebel fleet into a killing ground where the full weight of the Imperial Navy would crush them once and for all. The Alliance thought they were launching a surprise attack against an unfinished battle station defended by a skeleton crew. They were walking into a trap, engineered by the most cunning strategic mind in galactic history. The Emperor had manipulated events to ensure the rebels would learn about the second Death Star. He had arranged for the shield generator on Endor's moon to appear vulnerable. He had positioned the Imperial fleet to remain hidden until the rebel attack was fully committed. Every element was calculated to draw the Alliance into decisive engagement, exactly the kind of battle the Imperial Navy was designed to win. The Imperial fleet at Endor represented the concentrated might of an entire galactic empire. Star Destroyers in numbers that should have been overkill against any possible resistance. The Executor-class Star Destroyer, 19 kilometers of pure capital ship dominance, commanding the formation. Admiral Piet on the bridge, veteran of Hoth and countless other engagements, executing what should have been a textbook annihilation. The second Death Star, partially operational despite appearances, ready to vaporize rebel capital ships with its super laser. The Alliance fleet would jump in expecting to attack a construction site and find themselves facing the full operational power of a weapon that could destroy their cruisers one by one with each firing cycle. The rebellion brought a handful of Mon Calamari cruisers, some frigates, and starfighter squadrons. On paper, this should have been the end. The rebels had finally massed into a conventional fleet formation. They had finally presented targets worth hitting. Everything the Imperial Navy had been waiting for. The 25,000 Star Destroyers had been built for exactly this moment, a decisive fleet engagement where overwhelming firepower would achieve total victory. And then the fighter screens engaged, and everything the doctrine promised fell apart. Rebel starfighters exploited the same vulnerabilities they'd been exploiting for years. They approached from angles the turbolaser batteries couldn't track. They launched torpedoes at speeds the TIE interceptors couldn't match. They struck at bridge towers and shield generators and engine assemblies, the critical systems that Imperial design philosophy assumed would never be threatened by craft so small. Admiral Akbar, recognizing that his capital ships couldn't survive sustained fire from the Death Star's super laser, ordered his fleet to engage the Star Destroyers at close range. The decision was born of desperation. At that close range, we won't last long against those Star Destroyers. But it was brilliant nonetheless. By closing to point-blank range, the rebel fleet neutralized the Death Star's super laser. Firing on targets at that range risked destroying Imperial vessels along with rebel ones. But it also put rebel starfighters exactly where they needed to be, inside the TIE screen's effective defensive perimeter, with clear attack runs on Star Destroyer vulnerabilities. The Executor died because a single A-wing pilot, Arvel Crinid, flew his damaged fighter directly into the Super Star Destroyer's bridge. 19 kilometers of warship, the largest vessel in the Imperial fleet, killed by a starfighter that probably cost less than one of the Executor's refresher units. The official histories record it as a heroic sacrifice, which it was. But there's a more important question that those histories don't ask. How did that A-wing get close enough to kamikaze the bridge? Crinid's fighter had been damaged, his cockpit was destroyed, his craft was going down. But he had enough control to aim. He had time to line up the shot. And he had a clear approach vector because nothing was designed to stop him. Where were the point defense batteries that should have shredded an A-wing on approach? Where were the tracking systems that should have identified a threat vector converging on the command structure? Where were the dedicated anti-fighter weapons that any rational naval architect would have installed to protect the most critical section of the most important ship in the fleet? They didn't exist. Because the doctrine said TIE fighters would handle it. Because the philosophy that had killed the first Death Star and bled the Imperial Navy dry across 1,000 convoy ambushes was still in force. Because bad news didn't flow upward in Palpatine's empire, and the news that the fundamental design philosophy of the entire Navy was fatally flawed was the worst news imaginable. The A-wing got through because nothing was designed to stop it. The Executor's bridge tower was protected by shields, sure, but shields don't help much when a physical object, traveling at fighter speeds, is about to crash through your viewport. The TIE fighters were off fighting other TIE fighters, doing exactly what they were designed to do, and leaving the command tower undefended against the one threat nobody wanted to acknowledge. Previous engine damage from the sustained engagement had robbed the Executor of the maneuvering thrust needed to maintain orbit over the Death Star. When the bridge was destroyed, taking navigation control with it, the massive vessel began the slow, inevitable drift into the battle station's gravity well. The Executor plunged into the second Death Star. The fleet command structure collapsed. The Star Destroyers, lacking central coordination, became vulnerable to concentrated rebel attacks. And when the Death Star exploded, killed again by starfighters that Doctrine insisted couldn't matter, the remaining Imperial vessels fled into hyperspace. The Emperor died at Endor. So did the Executor. So did Star Destroyers, in numbers that represented years of production capacity and trillions of credits in investment. And it wasn't because the rebellion had built a better fleet. Their capital ships were hodgepodge conversions and second-hand cruisers, Mon Calamari vessels that had been designed as pleasure craft and passenger liners before being hastily retrofitted for combat. In a straight broadside engagement, the Imperial Navy would have obliterated them. It was because the rebellion had built a doctrine that exploited the exact vulnerability the Empire's ego couldn't acknowledge. The starfighters slipped through tie screens that couldn't intercept them. The torpedoes struck targets that had no point defense to stop them. The critical systems that nobody protected, because Doctrine said they didn't need protection, turned out to need protection after all. 25,000 Star Destroyers. Enough firepower to glass every rebel world in an afternoon. The largest military construction program in galactic history. They lost anyway. Not because the Empire was incompetent. The engineers who designed the Star Destroyer were brilliant. The shipyards that produced them were marvels of industrial capacity. Kuat drive yards alone employed millions of workers, entire worlds dedicated to the construction of vessels that represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. The officers who commanded them were, in many cases, skilled tacticians, doing their best within the constraints of a system that didn't allow adaptation. They lost because the Star Destroyer answered a question the rebellion never asked. The Empire built a fleet to defeat enemies who fought like the Separatist Confederacy. Massed capital ship formations engaging in broadside warfare. Conventional military tactics that rewarded overwhelming firepower and industrial capacity. Against that enemy, the 25,000 Star Destroyers would have been invincible. The Lucrehulks would have burned. The Providence Dreadnoughts would have burned. The entire Confederacy would have been crushed in a matter of months. Against the Yuzhan Vong, when they finally arrived decades later, Imperial tactics would have worked. The extragalactic invaders fought exactly the kind of war Palpatine's Navy was designed to win. Conventional fleet engagements, where capital ship firepower was decisive. But the rebellion? The rebellion fought like an insurgency because they were an insurgency. They had no choice. A handful of starfighters against the most powerful military machine ever constructed? Direct engagement was suicide. So they didn't engage directly. They hit and ran. They struck at vulnerabilities the Imperial doctrine couldn't acknowledge. They turned the Empire's strengths into weaknesses. The Star Destroyer's heavy armament couldn't track small craft. Strength becomes weakness. The TIE Fighter's lack of shields and hyperdrives kept it cheap and numerous, but meant it couldn't intercept high-speed torpedoes or pursue escaping attackers. Strength becomes weakness. The Imperial command structure's demand for compliance created a culture where nobody could report that Doctrine was failing. Strength becomes weakness. Palpatine built a fleet for enemies like himself, proud, conventional, standing their ground. He was a creature of the Clone Wars, thinking in terms of battle lines and fleet engagements and decisive confrontations where superior firepower won the day. He couldn't conceive of an enemy that would refuse to fight on his terms. He couldn't imagine that a handful of starfighters could threaten warships that had crushed every conventional navy that faced them. That failure of imagination cost him everything. The thermal exhaust port on the first Death Star wasn't an engineering flaw. It was a philosophical flaw. The assumption that something so small, so seemingly insignificant, couldn't possibly matter against something so massive and powerful. The decision to omit point defense from the Imperial II class wasn't a budget decision. It was a philosophical decision. The conviction that TIE fighters would always intercept any threat before it reached the hull. The rebellion found the gap and drove proton torpedoes through it, again and again and again. There's a lesson here that has nothing to do with starfighters or space battles. The most dangerous assumption any organization can make is that overwhelming force solves all problems. That being bigger, more powerful, and more heavily armed automatically means being safer. That enemies will fight on your terms because they have no choice. Enemies always have choices. Sometimes that choice is to refuse engagement entirely, to strike where you're weak rather than where you're strong, to turn your confidence against you, to exploit the gap between what you think is important and what actually matters. The Toyota Hilux beats the tank not by destroying it, but by being in a different place, fighting a different war, refusing the confrontation the tank is designed to win. The X-Wing beat the Star Destroyer the same way. Different scale, same principle. Different galaxy, same lesson. 25,000 Star Destroyers weren't enough, because numbers don't matter when you're solving the wrong problem. The Empire's autopsy is complete. The cause of death? Failure of imagination, compounded by institutional arrogance, in a culture that punished adaptation and rewarded conformity. A management philosophy that couldn't accept criticism, and therefore couldn't learn from failure. A design doctrine that solved the wrong problem brilliantly, while ignoring the right problem entirely. The Star Destroyer was a magnificent achievement. The TIE Fighter was an elegant solution to conventional fighter warfare. The Tarkin Doctrine was a coherent philosophy for maintaining control through terror. All of it was perfectly engineered for a war that never came. And that's exactly why they lost. Subscribe for more stories like this.